Bonjour tout le monde. Merci de nous accompagner cet après-midi pour le lancement de notre livre Royally Wronged, the Royal Society of Canada and Indigenous Peoples. My name is Cynthia Milton. I am a college member of the Royal Society of Canada. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you today to our introduction of the book, Royally Wronged, the Royal Society of Canada and Indigenous Peoples. I'm grateful to be speaking to you today from the lands of the Lekwungen peoples, as well as the Wisanic, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples whose land and continuous historical relationship with these lands to today. I want to say thank you to the RSC team, Walter House in particular, Linda Clausen, Michelle Seguin, and Darren Gilmore. Merci de tout notre cœur pour nous avoir accompagnés dans ce livre et pour le lancement d'aujourd'hui. I'd like to just take a minute to introduce our fearless moderator for today, Crystal Verdun. Crystal, thank you so much for offering to moderate today's session. Crystal has seen this book from its early days as a conversation as part of the RSC TRC task force. She read an early version of this book and has offered today to present to you the final product. Crystal, as many of you know, is a former professor in Canadian Studies at the University of Mount Allison. She is as well a scholar in Canadian women's writing in both French and in English. Without further ado, Crystal, I'll pass the baton metaphorically to you. Merci.
Merci, Cynthia. Thank you, and bonjour tout le monde. Kwe, Ani. It's an honor to participate in this important session today. I'm currently speaking from Montreal, where the RSC COEE, the Celebration of Excellence, is being hosted by McGill, which sits on the historic meeting place of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg Nations. My own university, Mount Allison, is located on the ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq people, and their knowledges and traditions, like those of other First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and Indigenous peoples globally, I daily acknowledge, honor, and respect. Thank you. Merci, et on y va. The format for today's session is a series of short presentations by a few of the editors and authors of the book. Other of the contributors may be watching online as well. The presentations will comprise brief reflections, 3 to 5 minutes, on why they participated in the book, what that experience was like, about the topics that they chose, and why the insights gained from the involvement. And then following the presentations, we'll have a Q&A on Slido. I believe you enter a participant number and we'll draw the questions from there. On peut prendre les questions en français ou en anglais, aucun problème, c'est comme vous voulez. And we'll get underway with thoughts from Cynthia Milton. As one of the editors, she'll introduce the book and she'll read an excerpt from a letter that Cindy Blackstock sent to the RSC, and that set in motion the collaborations that led to this book. Cynthia Milton, past president of the RSC's College of New Scholars, and formerly of the Université de Montréal in the Department of History, is now Associate Vice President of Research at the University of Victoria. In her own research, Professor Milton studies the construction of historical narratives after state violence, examining modes of truth-telling, memory, and transitional justice. So I'll pass it back to you, Cynthia, and we'll listen in on you for now.
Great, thank you very much, Crystal. So the idea today is I'd like to give you a bit of background on the book on behalf of the editorial team and the contributing authors. The editorial team is made up of Constance Backhouse, myself, Maggie Kovac, and Adele Perry. And we have a very strong team of contributing authors. We had hoped to be able to present to you in the chat function or on a slide the tables of contents, but unfortunately that's not possible right now. Perhaps Joanna could hold up a cover of the book or a copy of the table of contents, less than ideal, but we will make sure that this is available to you. So a bit of the background. It started in 2015, September of 2015, when Cindy Blackstock sent a letter to the then president of the RSC. When that letter went unanswered, she graciously and gently submitted it again. The second time we received that letter, it made its way to our RSC Council, where it was voted unanimously that the Royal Society of Canada should respond to her letter. In her graciously worded letter, Dr. Blackstock told the RSC of the need to reckon with its historical and ongoing marginalization of Indigenous knowledge and knowledge keepers. She argued that this was not a passive or indirect exclusion, rather that the RSC had been directly involved in the multi-generational violence. In her letter, she noted that among the RSC past members was Duncan Campbell Scott, who was its Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs and the primary architect of residential schools. Indeed, our book today is published on the 100th anniversary of his presidency of the Royal Society of Canada. So this volume is an interdisciplinary essay that is our response to Dr. Blackstock's call to actions. The book starts with her letter, which we will make available to you. It's published in the book. Unfortunately, she could not attend today. So this book is an offer of a modest first step, an undertaking that began by mainly RSC fellows and college members from Academies 1 and 2 of the Anglophone divisions, and mainly by settler scholars. While we would encourage Academy 3 to similarly consider their historic role, it is reasonable that the heavy lifting for this accountability and reckoning is done by settlers, with the insight and guidance of our Indigenous colleagues. The book is divided into 4 sections, for which you will hear from some of the authors today. The historical essays compose the first 2 sections of the book, and they focus on the time from the RSC's founding in 1882 up to the mid-20th century. The later chapters then bring the discussion forward to the present and future prospects for change. We offer these essays as a first step in taking ownership of the tragedies that non-Indigenous people have fomented against Indigenous communities. We thank the Indigenous scholars who have chosen to guide us in this challenging adventure, to participate in this book, and in particular, we thank Dr. Cindy Blackstock for showing us the initial path. Without further ado then, shall we hear from some of the authors?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cynthia. There's a note to say that the table of contents is now available in the chat. I think I have that correct. Yes, I've got that right. I'd like to introduce 3 of the contributors to the first part of the book called The RSC's Historic Role. Ian Warley, Constance Backhouse, and Adele Perry. 3 of the 4 contributors. The 4th is Carol Gerson. A very brief introduction to each of these amazing scholars. Ian Warley holds a PhD from Carleton. His interest in Canadian social and cultural history made him an ideal lead for examining the RSC's archives from its founding in 1882 through to the year of D.C. Scott's death, and that was in 1947. Constance Backhouse is professor of law at the University of Ottawa and author of a roster of award-winning books, the most recent of which is 2 Firsts, Bertha Wilson and Claire Leroux-Dubé at the Supreme Court of Canada. Finally, Adele Perry is professor of history and women's and gender studies at the University of Manitoba. And like Dr. Backhouse, the author of award-winning books examining histories of colonialism in Canada. So if Ian, Constance, and Adele would each follow one on the other and talk a little bit about their participation, their reflections on their participation in this project.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Crystal. And may I go ahead? Yes. Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone here. And I'd like to first say how much of an honor it was to take part in this project and to be here today. And I really appreciate the opportunity. I would like to begin with a brief discussion of why I wanted to be involved in this project. In 2018, I had recently completed a PhD in the Department of History at Carleton University, and I was eager for new projects outside of my core field of study. In many ways, this project was a gift for a newly minted PhD that I was. The vast majority of the archival material I needed for this project was politely arranged on a bookshelf at the RSC headquarters, with only a half dozen or so volumes requiring me to venture into the cavernous basement of Walter House, visits which were themselves rather unique and exciting experiences. Indeed, being invited by Dr. Jennifer Evans to sit in the breezy Roderick MacDonald room and pour myself over dozens of volumes of richly detailed history was an opportunity I could not pass up. Closer to home, I come from a family of educators and teachers, and as I embarked on my own teaching career after graduation, I was personally committed to learning what I could about the intellectual origins of the residential school system and its devastating impact on Indigenous peoples, both past and present. My choice of topic for this chapter is based on several factors. Much of my recent archival work had focused on tracing networks of knowledge and power through learned societies. I was fascinated by the intermingling of academic knowledge and political power and the ways in which these forces influence broader social and cultural transformations. After two intensive investigations into the Royal Society of Arts and the Royal Society of Chemical Industry in the UK, I felt best equipped to approach the RSC in a similar manner, that is, as an institution with tremendous power and privilege, and whose members were responsible for shaping the world in which we live today. Looking back on the totality of this project, I have come away with a few critical insights that have and will continue to impact my scholarship, teaching, and daily life. The first of these is that the history of this country and of Canadian institutions more generally is anything but polite. Despite being packaged in the formality and poshness of the RSC annual meeting, the history that I uncovered in the proceedings and transactions is violent. It is racist, it is exclusionary, and it is eviscerating. And I believe that every chapter in this edited collection exposes these facts. The final point I'll make is that in reading the early volumes of the proceedings and transactions, one can find some of Canada's best and brightest engaging in some of the worst and grimmest ideas in this country's history. These annual volumes, and indeed the edited collection we are discussing today, offer chilling insight into the networks of knowledge, power, and privilege that coursed through the RSC during its early years, networks that were responsible for conceiving and creating the systems of oppression that continue in the present day to shape every aspect of life in this country. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Warley. Dr. Bacchus?
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. It's a privilege to have worked with all of you who are present on the screen and those of you who are watching from far away. Let me talk just a little bit about how I got involved in this book project and then talk about what I discovered. I became an RSC fellow in 2004. It was a great honor. I was a young feminist scholar still, and I felt a little bit overwhelmed to be inducted into such an elite, esteemed body of scholars. And it was obvious to me as a feminist that it was almost entirely male. And at the time, I knew less about race discrimination than I did about gender, but it was also obvious that it was overwhelmingly white. In fact, although we did know that our stats were about 15% women members, imagine that in 2004, we didn't even know what our race composition was because nobody had thought it was proper to do a survey. Bolstered by the soon to become president, Rod MacDonald, after whom the room is named, in which Ian worked, Rod MacDonald was conscious of our lack of diversity and optimistic that things could improve. And with his backing, a number of us began to talk about what steps we could take to become more inclusive. We thought mainly in the shape of how do we get more members who are diverse. We weren't really thinking at that point about the substance of our scholarship. after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came down with their findings and their calls to action, after we were spoken to both by law professor Kathleen Mahoney and Indigenous scholar and activist Cindy Blackstock, a number of us began to reflect about what it was that we could do to aid in making a difference. And so we created the Royal Society's TRC task force, which I was privileged to co-chair with Cynthia Milton. And we've done a number of exciting things. We have over 60 members from the RSC. We're always looking for new members and more. But one of the things we decided we could do was to try to prepare a volume of essays about our past and our future in terms of the substantive scholarship and the understanding of knowledge. And that's what's come together today and this was planned on the 100th anniversary of Duncan Campbell Scott's presidency of our society. So why did I pick to do a piece of research on Duncan Campbell Scott, which is the title of my chapter? Well, obviously he is probably our most infamous member. He is, as many of you who read Indigenous history and follow the current discussions about residential schools and TRC issues, you will know that he was one of the most notorious advocates of assimilation of Indigenous communities. And what was so interesting for RSC people is that it was like a triangle. So here's Duncan Campbell Scott up at the top of the point of the triangle. Here's the Royal Society down in one corner. And here is the Department of Indian Affairs down in the other. So there is this array. And what I thought had not been studied well enough was the extent to which the Royal Society figured into Duncan Campbell Scott, into the Department of Indian Affairs. How are we linked in that triangle? And of course, I discovered a great deal of interesting things in volumes that Ian surveyed for us and assisted us in locating particular pieces of information. I discovered that Duncan Campbell Scott enhanced his reputation as a white man expert in Indigenous issues because of his Royal Society fellowship. The Society then presided over a series of scholars who created a bedrock of racist ideas that bolstered the damaging policies of the Department of Indian Affairs. Within the RSC, an entirely white and male organization, Scott and his other fellows helped to create what counted as knowledge and expertise. They served as credentializers, men who were guarantors of reliable knowledge that was deemed central to the national development. It was an explosive triangle. Duncan Campbell Scott, the Royal Society of Canada, and the Department of Indian Affairs. And the elite linkages of our society served to intensify the detrimental consequences of racist ideologies that created such harms for Indigenous peoples and communities. So that's just a little bit about what I canvass in my chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Backhouse. More about Duncan Campbell Scott with Professor Perry.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for all of the work that has gone into both this book, the project that informs it, and then this particular event. I'll just begin by a few words in my kind of awkward toddler Anishinaabe which is to say, Adele Perry Nadishnakas, Gawin Nidu Dimsi, Winnipeg Ninduji, Zaganash Kwe Ninda. My name's Adele Perry. I don't know my clan. I live in Winnipeg and I'm a non-Indigenous, a settler, and a white woman. I'm here speaking to you from Treaty 1 territories, territories of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Métis people, governed by the sacred promises of Treaty 1 and of the Manitoba Act, and where we drink water from Treaty 3 in Northwestern Ontario. And that story informs my particular kind of piece in this collection, which is a kind of a continuation of ongoing work I've been doing for the past little while, looking at the relationship between the city of Winnipeg, where I've lived for a couple of decades, settler colonialism and drinking water, and how that ties it in very direct and consequential and visceral ways to a consequential series of land losses that occurred for a small Anishinaabe community sitting at the border of Manitoba and Ontario, Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. And these were land losses that occurred between 1913 and 1919 and led in very direct ways to that community's reserve lands being trisected, divided into three, which led in very direct ways to them becoming one of the many waterless First Nations across Canada. And that has been a status they have maintained until about a month ago, where their more than 20-year-old boil water advisory was finally broken. And it's a story that in many respects is repeated in a whole range of ways across the country and in the archives that those of us who are speaking to you right now are familiar with, where an Indigenous community loses something, whether it's land, whether it's water, whether it's hydroelectric power, in the direct service of a non-Indigenous community. And in this case, that was the city of Winnipeg's need for clean drinking water. But how this cuts into the stories that we're investigating here is the central role that Duncan Campbell Scott played in this, as in so many of these stories. And it was in these years that Duncan Campbell Scott was the principal architect of sort of Indigenous policies, his deputy superintendent general of Indian Affairs, and ultimately the person in Ottawa who signed off on a particularly egregious set of land losses that produced the situation whereby Winnipeg got clean drinking water, Shoal Lake 40 was cut into three, and ultimately ended up in circumstances where they lost the ability to have that same drinking water they supplied to the city of Winnipeg. And this is not even a footnote in the fairly substantial scholarship on Duncan Campbell Scott. It doesn't show up in any of the published work that I was able to access, or even in what little I've looked at of his kind of archival work. But it was an event that had enormous consequences for the community of Shoal Lake 40, and also by extension for the city of Winnipeg. And it worked to dispossess and to strip resources from the Indigenous community and deliver it to a settler community. And I think in that sense, it's a story that speaks in really kind of vivid terms to the project that we're engaged in here, which is to take an institution, the Royal Society of Canada, and to begin to unpack sort of the central and largely unspoken work it has done within the both formal and informal kind of creation of structures that resource non-Indigenous communities at the very direct expense of Indigenous ones. And this is a project that is political, and it's also a project that is intellectual. And it is a project that this book takes up one part of, but it's one part of a much wider project that involves, I think, all of us, whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous, but particularly falling on the shoulders of settlers who have benefited from so much of this process, and institutions that have benefited from so much of this process, engaging in, I think, really kind of rigorous and clear-sighted investigation of these institutions, and rendering visible and rendering accountable the resources that we have inherited, whether we asked to or not, that have structured our world and that have given us so much and have taken so much from others. And in that sense, I see my part in this book as being part of that larger project of my own work as a historian, kind of committed to sort of processes of decolonization in a wide range of contexts, as a feminist kind of committed to sort of registering the way that inequity works in so many different respects. And as somebody who is committed to working incrementally in whatever way possible for change in the organizations that I'm a part of. So I became a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 2017, fairly recently. And I was glad to enter at a moment where this work was being done. And I am committed to continuing on this work and honored to be doing so with everybody. here on the call today, and those of us who are not able to join us on the call. Thank you.
Merci, Professor Perry. That is 3 of the 4 contributors to the first part of the book. The fourth is Carol Gerson, who looked at the poetry of Pauline Johnson, who is a contemporary of D.C. Scott. So the first part of the book is very engaging in terms of the relationship between D.C. Scott and the development of the Royal Society. Going to move on to the second part of the book. We don't have contributors from that, but in case people haven't seen the table of contents in the chat, I can say that there are 3 essays in this section. One by John Reed, the first by John Reed, who looks at 3 fellows of the Royal Society, other than D.C. Scott. Cynthia Milton herself has contributed to this second section of the book. And the third is by James Walker. So that is in the second part of this book. We do, however, have contributors on the panel from the third part of the book, which is called Rethinking Academia and Indigeneity. And they are Catherine Nichols and Joanna Quinn. I'll introduce perhaps first Catherine, and then we'll move on to Joanna. Catherine Nichols is a PhD candidate at Sir Simon Fraser, where she's pursuing an interdisciplinary project that involves the university's 2 departments, the Department of Indigenous Studies and the Department of Archaeology. In partnership with the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation, her work focuses on locating cemeteries at the Brandon Indian Residential School in Manitoba. Catherine?
All right, just getting oriented here. Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine, and I'm really honored to be here representing all of my co-authors. I'm calling from Brandon, Manitoba, and it's on Treaty 2 territory. But more importantly, it's on the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene, and Métis people. And I just wanted to start off by saying that Indian residential school cemeteries and unmarked graves are on the public radar in a way that wasn't when we started this work. And when I reached out to Dr. Eldon Yellowhorn at Simon Fraser University back in 2016, I really was drawn to him because of his experience working with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Missing Children's Project. And I was delighted and relieved when he agreed to take me on. And he really helped me put together a great committee, a team of experts, and we applied for funding. And this really resulted in sort of what was discussed at the beginning of my intro there, is that we were successful in getting a SSHRC Partnership Development Grant, and it's being led by Sioux Valley Dakota Nation, and it's supported by university partners at Simon Fraser University, Brandon University, and the University of Windsor. So in 2018, in response to Dr. Cindy Blackstock's letter to the Royal Society, we submitted an abstract for the RSC's call for papers. I had learned about Cindy Blackstock when I was doing my master's, and I was really glad that our team was ready to write a piece in response to her call. I had also gone back to university as a graduate student purely for practical reasons. At the time, I couldn't find any other way to address the serious gaps that allowed residential school cemeteries to go unprotected, that left potential unmarked graves in limbo, and permitted missing Indigenous children to remain anonymous. So in our chapter, we discussed 2 known cemeteries and additional areas of concern on the school property. Taken as a whole, we've identified 104 potential unmarked graves, and I've included this photo here that I took this summer. And it's a memorial of orange hearts. It was created by Sioux Valley Dakota Nation's Tawahe Services. And it's located on the north side of the valley in front of where the school used to stand. And it stands there in honor of all of the missing children from the Brandon Residential School. So I'm ready for the next slide, please. Since there are so many people to thank, I've made this acknowledgement slide. I just wanted to also show that this type of work doesn't happen in isolation, and it wouldn't be possible without the network of people and partnerships. And I sincerely apologize if I've forgotten anyone. So I just wanted to thank my committee, the faculty at our partner universities and our partner organizations. And I sincerely wanted to thank the editors for their support throughout the writing process. I'm looking at you, Cynthia. And finally, I just wanted to give a really special thank you to the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation community for their continued patience, understanding, and guidance throughout this project. And I really am forever grateful to all of you. So I'm ready for the next slide. This fall, Sioux Valley Dakota Nation hosted a community event on September 30th for the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And the organizing team asked us for a poster so that the names of every child who died while attending the Brandon Residential School could be read aloud. These children paid the ultimate price. And while Duncan Campbell Scott can't solely be blamed, it was over the course of his career and while he was a member of the Royal Society that an alarming number of Indigenous children died in residential schools. And because of insufficient consideration was given to the administration of cemeteries, of the school cemeteries, the graves of these children were abandoned, and now they are unmarked across the country. This is the reason why we wrote this chapter, to explain why we need to do these kinds of investigations in the first place, and to show that despite the many challenges, we are overcoming these issues by working together so that we can restore the dignity and honor to these children and their grave sites in the ways and desires of their families. So while these 98 names of children come from my own graduate research and the NCTR Memorial Registry, we also want to acknowledge the children whose names and graves have not been recovered and remain missing, and for whom we will keep searching. So thank you for your time and attention.
Political Science at the University of Western Ontario. Oh, I see I was muted. Where she's director of the Center for Transitional Justice and Post-Conflict Reconstruction. Like Cynthia, Dr. Quinn is a past president of the RSC's College of New Scholars, and I will turn the camera to her.
Thank you, Crystal. As all of you can tell, it's a real privilege to be included in this group of fantastic scholars and in such a body of scholarship. For me, Cindy Blackstock's challenge all those years ago now struck me like a bolt of lightning. And I remember sitting in that ballroom, frantically scribbling notes and feeling convicted that if I was going to be part of an organization like the Royal Society, I needed to take her challenge seriously. So I'm a scholar of transitional justice and international relations, and I've made a career of looking out there at places like Uganda and Haiti. And I've paid careful attention to relations between different ethnic groups and about the things we can do to help those communities live together after war. I work on how to confront the legacies of past human rights abuses and atrocities to build a future that's free of inequality and violence. And while it might seem strange for somebody like me to think about peace in the context of a place like Canada, an already established democracy and under little threat of actual war, the peace-building literature has a considerable amount to offer if, instead of looking at peace as the absence of war, we look more deeply to consider how the causes of inequality and harm and violence are responsible for the kinds of pain and hardship that Indigenous people in Canada have experienced. And that's what Galtung called positive peace, or the eradication of the root causes of that harm. Yet when Canada started down its road to truth and reconciliation, I felt like it wasn't something I had any business thinking about, even though I'd written a book about truth commissions and about the utility of acknowledging the past, and even though I've lived in Canada my whole life. But still, even though I felt a personal conviction to get involved in the work of reconciliation, I didn't see how my international work and what was happening here at home We're at all related. I have come to understand that the way our Canadian society is organized causes inequality and harm and violence. And that structure extends, as I talk about in my chapter, to the institutions that make up our society, including, of course, the Royal Society of Canada. So my argument in the paper is that the influence of the Royal Society has extended to universities across the country by establishing an intellectual hierarchy based explicitly on contributions by a specific kind of scholar, normally a white man, a specific kind of contribution, normally Eurocentric knowledge, and has created barriers to discriminate against people who don't fit into those categories. Indigenous scholars and the recognition of Indigenous ways of knowing and being have traditionally been excluded. And because this set of ideas was held up as the best of the best by the Royal Society, itself the best of Canadian scholarship, they were held up as ideals also by universities across the country. And this has served to further the structural inequality and harm. So as the now former president of the college, I've been really honored to be a small part of this project. It echoes the work that the college is doing on decolonization and diversity and equity and inclusion. And I hope that this book and my chapter will be part of the acknowledgement of the inequality and exclusion that the Royal Society and universities across the country are trying to confront. Thanks, Crystal, back to you.
Thank you, Professor Quinn. We'll move on to the fourth section of the book called Future Directions. And we have the honor to have words from Marie Baptiste. Marie Baptiste is Mi'kmaq from the Potluck First Nation in Nova Scotia, professor in the Department of Education Foundations at the University of Saskatchewan. Professor Baptiste is known nationally and internationally for her work in Aboriginal knowledge and teaching, which has opened up whole new areas of research, as I think her groundbreaking book, which has had a lot of influence on me personally, Decolonizing Education, Nourishing the Learning Spirit, attests. Professor Baptiste.
Gwe and Madawaloktiok and Waldasi aim out and I'm Marie Baptiste, I'm Mi'kmaq Alnu from Bodladek, and I'm situated today on my traditional, ancestral, unceded and unpurchased lands of the Mi'kmaq people in Unama'ki, one of the 7 districts of the Mi'kmaq Nation that stretches throughout the Atlantic provinces. I'm also recently hired to a special advisor to the Vice President Academic and Dean of Unama'ki College at Cape Breton University on decolonizing the academy. So that's very new. The chapter or the memorandum that is part of this book came about as part of the Royal Society visiting tour in July of 2019. And Joanna positions especially her interest, which came as to find out by visiting the prairies what kinds of Indigenous issues and scholarship and leaders and other kinds of things that they needed to meet to find out how the Royal Society might be positioned in the future. And as a member of the Royal Society, it was of 2016, I attended our first evening together at that listening tour. And we sat around in a very convivial occasion of dinner and drinks and so on. And finally, as we sat down to chat after we had our first meal, a question was asked, why are there so few Indigenous scholars in the Royal Society of Canada? And that gave me the moment to let loose all the things I had been holding about how the Royal Society represented a Eurocentric knowledge system, a very privileged, power generating, enacting system that created the hierarchy of knowledge systems around the world and positioned Indigenous knowledge outside of the realm of knowledge, positioned all of its excellence and its millenniums of living on the land, living in different languages, in the expertise it took to live without all the modern conveniences, as well as moving into and through colonialism. And it was an opportunity for me to explain what the Royal Society missed by ignoring for centuries the knowledge systems of Indigenous people. As we went through the next day talking about and having a walking tour and discussions in Wanuskewin Heritage Park, it was another opportunity to talk to everyone in that group informally about what our conversations were. And it was Jeremy who invited me to write a memo or a letter to them to explain those things that I'd been talking about. And in so doing, I started this letter, enlisted my partner Sagej in that, and pretty soon we had a firm letter, and then we sent it around to all of our Royal Society Indigenous scholars and said, hey, read this, tell us what you'd want to add and to this letter, and would you like to join in this and being a endorser of this letter as we sent it to the Royal Society, and we did. And so as a result of that, this memo, a very short one, tells a very strong story about of where we think hope in the Royal Society can go by the activism of Indigenous scholars and the development of Indigenous knowledge traditions and how they might blend as a transsystemic notions, bringing together Indigenous and the Royal Society or Indigenous and Eurocentric knowledge system in what we call transsystemic knowledge systems. With that, we are has led to my being enlisted on the membership committee for the Royal Society Committee, Royal Society, and I have done so this past year, putting together with a working group a wonderful list of all the kinds of things that we think are important to bring forward, and all 12 of those recommendations have been approved, and taken forward, and now I'm enlisted to continue this journey by encouraging institutions across Canada, as well as the Royal Society, in encouraging them to broadly consider how Indigenous knowledge systems might be acknowledged in their excellence from Indigenous excellence and from the Indigenous experts who are the ones who should mediate that particular excellence criteria. So we have a lot to do, and I guess what it says in that chapter or that section is there's hope. And I think by virtue of this Royally Wrong book, we are beginning to bring that story to the public, and it's something that people haven't known, and now it's something that you can't turn your eyes away from once you are there. And so I'm hoping that it brings hope as well as activism among the scholars that are part of the Royal Society and beyond.
Thank you, Dr. Baptiste. We have one more contribution from the panel. It is from Margaret Kovac, who could not be here today, but has pre-recorded her contribution. She draws on what she wrote as an afterword. She calls it a closing circle words for the book. It's a fascinating, fascinating part of the book. Dr. Kovac is from Treaty 4 territory in southern Saskatchewan, professor in the Faculty of Education at UBC. Her work focuses on the role of Indigenous knowledge, theory, and community partnership in research. It is no wonder her award-winning book, Indigenous Methodologies, Characteristics, Conversations, and Contexts, has just been newly reissued in a second edition in 2021. This is a recording, and I believe we're drawing on some assistance from Walter House for hearing that on the panel.
Ni totem, kitsikesum, sakaweo pism esqueo, tonse bojo, and greetings. I offer my participation on this panel today from my home in Vancouver, BC, and I join you from the beautiful unceded territories of the Musqueam people, and I acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this territory, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. Hi and megwich to the co-editors, contributing authors, and the inspiring forces, and all who are here today to celebrate this book. As part of my contribution today, I will read an excerpt from the closing circle words. This was the contribution that I made to our book, Royally Wronged, the Royal Society of Canada and Indigenous Peoples. I'm going to read a couple of very short excerpts, and then it is my understanding that there'll be a time for some comments or a time for some questions. So I'll put on my glasses here and we'll get started. From the far and near history of colonialism within the shifting Canadian landscape, several motivations animate this anthology. One purpose is to explore the historical role of the Royal Society of Canada in the complicit and explicit colonization of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. In doing so, there is a desire to hold accountable the words, language, policy, and actions arising from its members. We point specifically to Duncan Campbell Scott, a fellow of the Royal Society. In 1921 to 22, he was the president of the Royal Society of Canada. During this period, he found favor among the Canadian elite while using his influence to batter Indigenous societies through the mechanisms of public policy and scholarly authority. Thus, this edited volume seeks to reckon with this history, and in this sense, it has as a focus on the past. This anthology moves equally with the forward purpose of calling out colonialism in contemporary Canadian scholarship to resist ongoing colonial reproduction in knowledge production. In reading the contributions by each author in this edited volume, I sense a collective longing to tell a fuller story. One after another, each chapter asserts that Canadian scholarship has been formed and embedded in a white settler politic, a colonial affliction marked by a Canadian settler consciousness conflicted about Indigenous peoples. Certainly, this conflicted consciousness does not apply across the board. Influential settlers, as Duncan Campbell Scott, were not conflicted on Indigenous erasure, and so weaponized Canadian policy in an attempt to erase and rid Canada of the Indian problem. Nor was a 2018 Saskatchewan all-white jury conflicted in acquitting Gerald Stanley for the murder of Colton Boushie of Red Peasant First Nation From an Indigenous perspective, Indigenous people are not conflicted about erasure either. This is our homeland. In the face of harm done to Indigenous people, we continue to strive for peaceful coexistence, but we will not be erased. If there is to be respect for Indigenous scholars, the anti-colonial way forward requires that Indigenous scholarship be recognized within scholarly institutions at a deep level. Specifically, this will require several efforts. A, that Indigenous scholarship, as governed by Indigenous knowledge systems and practices, articulated in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, be explicitly acknowledged within tenure and promotion policies within Canadian universities. B, that both senior university leadership and the collegium work together to ensure that Indigenous scholars have the option to be adjudicated for tenure and promotion based upon Indigenous scholarship standards. And C, that the racism and the shame that diminishes Indigenous scholars within academic environments desist. Anti-colonialism and anti-racism must not take a back seat in times of fiscal restraint. These efforts will require operationally funded educational resourcing and accountability measures to move away from the erasure salvage continuum to a relationship of respect and equity. The Royal Society of Canada is well situated to be a powerful influencer in these calls to action. To not see Indigenous erasure or salvage scholarship in the history of powerful Canadian institutions such as the Royal Society of Canada is to choose not to see. To read this edited volume and not be awakened to Indigenous exclusion, past and present, is a choice. Still, this Canada, struggling with a truth and reconciliation that chafes, has not yet written its final word of who we are. Day by day, year upon year, decade after decade, Indigenous peoples persist. Each day, we find an ally. In the pages of this book, the contributors bring Indigenous intellectual contributions into view. Through our words, we seek to open doors, cast light on dark corners, bring into the consciousness that which has been hidden in plain view. Through our bookish, erudite words, we say to Indigenous people of this land, I see you. You matter. Ekose. Miigwech.
Thank you to Dr. Kovach. I would say that her words, closing circle words, not only perfect for the book, but they will also be the closing words for this panel as we've approached the end of the hour. I think that we can take heart that there will be local book launches at the different chapters of the Royal Society, at least that is the hope. And so questions can be asked then. Also, people who have not been able to be on the panel, but who have participated in the book, or even just in the meetings that took place, will be able to interact with readers of the volume. For me, it was a real privilege to read the book in its draft stages and to attend the various meetings that took place. And it was a real joy then to get the copy of the book and to read through it again and see the work that was done. I'm looking at the panelists here and wondering if we will just have to agree that there is no time for Q&A, sadly, from those who may be listening in, and to, I think, express thanks to those who were here for today, Cynthia Milton, Constance Backhouse, Ian Warley. I'm not doing it in the order of speech, but Adele Perry, Marie Baptiste, Catherine Nichols, and Joanna Quinn. Also, thanks, of course, to the whole staff in Walter House in Ottawa who help us to get these panels up and running. And to those who have listened in today, to those who will read the book in the future, it looks like we may be making some progress at the Royal Society of Canada. I believe I will, on that note, ask if I have any reason not to formally end the session. I think we've reached the 5 o'clock hour, but I'll double check with Cynthia, whose hand just went up. Cynthia, you're muted.
Thank you, everyone. Merci bonjour à tout le monde pour nous accueillir ce soir. Et j'espère qu'on aura l'occasion de nous rencontrer en personne lors de le prochain lancement du livre, soit au Québec, soit en Colombie-Britannique. Et bonsoir à tous et à toutes. Merci.
Merci Cynthia, et on peut dire au revoir et puis à la prochaine. Au revoir tout le monde.